Just waiting for a few people to join, and then we'll get started. Excellent. Thank you. So good morning and welcome to this waterfront webinar, Speeding Up the NSIPs Process, what progress has been made and what more can be done. With the Planning and Infrastructure Bill proposing reforms meant to enable the quicker planning of NSIPs, what do these mean for the future planning of projects? I'm Sarah Price. I'm a director of the planning consultancy DWD, with 24 years of private sector experience, most of it in infrastructure. It's a really exciting time to be in infrastructure planning. We've more projects than ever in planning across a wide range of technologies. But is the various sectors bringing forward projects enough? What's the impact of grid reform, and are our statutory bodies sufficiently resourced and tasked with finding appropriate solutions? We have some excellent speakers here today to share their views on this, and then there'll be an opportunity for questions. Please send yours through by dropping them in the Q&A section that you'll find at the bottom of the screen, and then we can take those questions at the end. So I'm looking forward to a really lively discussion today. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Colin Turnbull, who's a director at DWD with 20 years of experience specialising in infrastructure, with 3 DCOs made during that period. He's responsible for leading teams to secure robust and viable consents. So if I hand over to Colin now, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Sarah. So hopefully you can all hear me well. I'm going to sort of spend the next 10 minutes or so talking about the current pre-application prospectus that came in about 1.5 years ago. It was announced 1.5 years ago. It was implemented in full from October last year, with charging of all projects beginning in April this year. So promoters first have to request one of 3 tiers of service from the inspectorate, and they pay on a per month basis for the appropriate tier. I won't go into the full detail of it all. Hopefully you're all broadly familiar with it, but these three tiers, the first basic tier involves keeping the inspectorate updated with progress, not really a lot more, to be honest. The second tier is called standard, and that corresponds roughly to what promoters received prior to the prospectus. And the upper tier, which is called enhanced, allows more inspector involvement and advice, and it's a prerequisite for the new fast track examination and termination. So all promoters must prepare a programme document and issues tracker and have regard to advice provided by the inspectorate under section 51 of the Act. So 1 year in, how is this pre-application prospectus delivering? On its introduction, the inspectorate wrote that the reforms will do 3 broad things. I'm slightly paraphrasing. One of them is substantially improve the service through the provision of more focused and helpful advice. The second was enhance certainty of timescales and provide smoother and potentially faster post-submission stages. So you'll note there's a few caveats around speed. And the third one was to support well-prepared applications and improve project outcomes. So I just thought I'd add in a few sort of comparisons with what I think applicants need from the inspectorate. So I support mainly energy infrastructure developers, also industrial developers using the DCO process at a range of project stages, from sort of inception stage to examination stage. My take on this is that what they want to need from the inspectorate is, well, they need clear and robust EIA scoping opinions, because that is a big factor in the amount of assessment and so forth that you've got to do for your project. They expect procedural advice relevant to their level of expertise, because all developers and all teams are a bit different in that regard. And they want professionals who work well with their project teams. And above all, they'll need robust and timely examinations, recommendations and decisions. So I'll share some perspectives, and I'll sort of split this into 2. Firstly, projects transitioning into the new arrangements, so they maybe started their pre-application stage before the new arrangements came in, so they've had to move into this new sort of pre-application world, and also the experience of projects that have commenced their pre-application stage following the introduction of the prospectus. So for projects that have transitioned, firstly, there's been a phased introduction that has been helpful. I would say there's been a pragmatic approach from the inspectorate in relation to the new issues tracker document and the programme document. And to recap, this issues tracker is intended to be created at the EIA scoping stage and then kept updated. So it sort of makes sense that if you've not done one at scoping stage because you started way before the concept was introduced, then it doesn't make a lot of sense to start doing that midway or sort of late in your pre-application stage. And this does seem to be recognised. Similarly, a programme document for these projects probably needs to be fairly concise, because you probably got your programme pretty established by the mid part of your pre-application stage. The inspectorate does issue Section 51 advice for projects that transitioned. This gets published on their website. And it's a bit early to comment on the quality of this advice. There's definitely more of it. It seems pretty perceptive most of the time. I would say the inspectors engaged in meetings, they're asking lots of pertinent questions, and they're clearly preparing well for meetings, and they're assigning appropriate people to cases. So we are seeing, a pretty decent service from the inspectorate. And the inspectorate's clarified its provision of reviews of draft documents. So this has always been something that they've optionally offered to applicants prior to their submission. And this was starting to take longer and longer before they introduced cost recovery. It was getting to sort of sometimes 8 weeks to turn that around. This has improved, so they now say 6 weeks is the norm. There's a pretty sensible range of documents that they'll review under that standard service, and they'll review a much wider range under the enhanced service. And I think it's worth noting that under either service, an examining inspector will review the draft DCO, while other officers will review other documentation. There's a lot of pre-application advice that's been codified and published online, and I do mean a lot. There's even sort of detail about how you're meant to use, how you're meant to number your application documents, and it's fairly useful stuff. You do have to, read it all and then explain your divergences from it where appropriate, because numbers, there can't be a one-size-fits-all approach for numbering your application documents. But there's a lot of advice there to read, so it's not just that they're giving more Section 51 advice. The current streamlining consultation by MHCLG, I'm not going to speak a lot about it. My fellow speakers will say a bit more. But one of the proposals is to strengthen the acceptance tests, and this will include having regard to the S51 advice received. So, it's not really that different to the current situation where promoters are expected to show in the consultation report how they've had regard to that advice. But under either way, you've got to, really take that S51 advice quite seriously. And I think, maybe in hindsight, there's been a bit of a double whammy for some promoters. They've had to get used to these new pre-application arrangements while they still got all this outgoing statutory consultation procedure to comply with, that the reforms are looking at getting rid of. So, that double whammy, it's a bit more work, but, is it leading to some benefits? And I would say there are some upsides already apparent. We've analysed the latest 15 projects to be examined or at examination stage, and 4 of the 15 have forecasted or actual durations of between 4 months for examination and 5 months, 2 weeks. That's quite a good improvement on the 6 months. So, there are still 11 with forecasted or actual examination durations of 6 months. But, I think we can see the direction of travel there, with almost a third of them going faster. So in summary, what have transitioning projects experienced? Improved service, yes, slightly. Certainty of timescales, smooth and faster post-submission. This seems to be the case. It's a bit early to say. And support to well-prepared applications and improved project outcomes. This isn't as relevant to transitioning projects because they've already, they've only had, the pre-application prospectus for part of their pre-application. So they've not had that sort of long-standing advice that might have caused sort of different project outcomes. I think it's worth saying briefly that this all comes at a cost. The pre-application service costs between £63,000 and £212,000 per year, and this is on top of cost recovery by statutory bodies. So cost recovery has rapidly become a material addition to a developer's budget at the planning stage. So overall, the reforms have been introduced smoothly, I would say, and I just note that it's crucial that the inspectorate remains, focused on sort of delivering those faster post-submission stages. For projects starting under the new arrangements, I'll just say a bit about those. The inception stage becoming more involved. Applicants are expected to do quite a few steps around the time of the inception meeting, around preparation of a programme document. The choice of service tier has to be requested. You're meant to consult statutory bodies about that as well. You've got to provide your case information for the website, and then the invoicing happens. I just wanted to sort of flag the timescales for all of that. There's 2 to 3 week wait for a meeting, and then there's a wait of 2 to 4 weeks for the invoice. So all of that has to be done and paid before you can submit your EIA scoping. So if you haven't been sort of too clever with your programming, you might have 2.5 months between requesting your inception meeting and submitting your EIA scoping. So, you've got to allow time for that, but I think it'd be quite good if the inspectorate can try and reduce some of those timescales. And a little bit like transitioning projects, I think in hindsight, there's a bit of a double or even a triple whammy going on for projects that have just started under the regime, because they're preparing peer documents and SOC documents because that's what the norm is and that's what statutory bodies expect at the moment. But they're going to, they've got the pre-application stage advice to deal with. They're still relatively new, and they're going to have a greater acceptance test under the new reforms due to the S51 advice acceptance test. So, there's quite a lot for developers to get to grips with. I would characterise this all as something that applicants should prepare for rather than be concerned by. And, if we can all, keep focusing on how to reduce that post-submission stage, that, we should be able to, make a good thing of these reforms. So that's all I have for now. I'll hand over to Chris.
Thank you, Colin. That's really interesting insights. I'll now introduce Chris Taylor, who is Head of Planning and Consents at Progressive Energy. Chris leads consenting for HyNet, the UK's leading industrial decarbonisation cluster, and he's a chartered environmentalist with a PhD in atmospheric chemistry and climate change, and has been delivering major infrastructure projects for 20 years, both here in the UK, but also Australia and the Middle East. So a really wide range of experience. Thank you, Chris, if I hand over to you. And also, sorry, just before I do, could I please ask people to drop their questions in the Q&A as we go? We've got a really good number of people attending the webinar today, so it'd be really interesting to get those questions and seek the panelists' views. Thank you, Chris.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sarah, and good morning, everybody. So yes, I of my sins, head of planning consents for Progressive Energy, and we are the originators of the HyNet Industrial Decarbonisation Cluster, which is a full chain carbon capture and storage, and also hydrogen cluster. I am also now Land and Consents Director for the Peak Cluster, which is a really ambitious project to decarbonise 40% of the UK's lime and cement industry, which is based in and around the Peak District, and connect those sites with carbon capture to storage in the East Irish Sea in the Morecambe Net Zero store, which is being developed by Spirit Energy. A reasonable amount of experience on prior NSIPs. HyNet includes 4, along with a DNS and probably more than a dozen town and country planning applications. We're now at the early stages of the formal pre-application phase for Peak Cluster, which will be one integrated consent, but a particularly complex one, including a very significant length of buried CO2 pipeline and the connection to the CO2 store to Milo Water Springs. So it's an interesting perspective, looking at sort of lessons learned from previous projects and really where we are now at the start of a complex application during a period of NSIP reform and likely change during that consenting process over the next few years. So we sort of trying to get quickly out the blocks with taking our consent forward without an entirely clear picture of what the finish line looks like because of those changes to acceptance and so on that Colin has mentioned. So I'll start with sort of some, I guess, practical experience and my observations of the system and how it's working at the moment. Talk a little bit about some of the uncertainty in the system and some of my thoughts on what else we need to look at as part of NSIP reform to make the whole system fit for purpose. So I'll start with people because we think a lot around the legislation and the guidance, but actually a lot of what makes the planning system either work or fail is the people that are in it and the people that are engaging and the way in which they do so. So clearly we've got a whole range of stakeholders who for a long time now have been chronically under-resourced, which has made it very difficult for them to respond adequately. And I think also probably a culture that was perhaps more adversarial than it needed to be, and perhaps people see themselves as, I don't know, sort of gatekeepers rather than focusing on quality of applications and making making for better development. My observation now is that, particularly through engaging with the major casework and NSIP teams at, for example, Natural England and the Environment Agency, and indeed with NRW in Wales, is that I'm seeing actually really positive engagement with the applicant, which is fantastic to see. My experience has been that they have engaged really positively. We make an effort to make sure that we go out and speak to them early and provide clear indication of what projects are coming, both in terms of that patchwork of consents for HyNet and complex consents like Peak Cluster. So it is really pleasing to see that positive engagement, and those organisations, I think historically have always been very siloed. With when I started on HyNet, I ran a briefing session for Environment Agency, and I think I had attendees from more than half a dozen different departments in the Environment Agency, all who were working on some part of HyNet, and none of whom spoke to each other or knew what the rest of those teams were doing. And I think that is much improved now. Communication is much clearer. There's still that distinction between the planning and permitting teams in the EA, for example, but I think there is much more readiness to work together and collaborate, which I'm delighted to see. I guess for me, there is an open question at the moment over whether the changes to cost recovery, putting that financial burden on the applicant, one would hope that would result in an improved level of resourcing and therefore improved service from those organisations. I'm not sure that is the case. I don't know whether the funding of other sources has been reduced in line with that. So I don't know whether they are going to be adequately resourced for the large number of projects that are moving through the system. I think that remains to be seen. I say that certainly the approach at a lead planning level is fantastic. Whether they can get the level of technical support that they need from all their various specialists, I keep my fingers crossed, and we'll see what happens over the next few years as cost recovery really beds in. Clearly not the only stakeholders that are important. We've also got to think about, for example, local planning authorities. That is much more of a mixed bag in my experience. With these large scale projects, we work with a lot of them. HyNet probably crosses 3-4 different authorities. It's at least 4 different authorities. Peak Cluster will cross at least 9. Some of those authorities are experienced with the NSIP process, very keen to engage. Some of them we know already through HyNet. And that engagement is really positive. Other ones, much more difficult to begin speaking to them about major infrastructure, and that is problematic because they have such a key role in shaping the application. Alex will talk more about various aspects of the current consultation on NSIP reform. But one of the things I note in there is that there is the potential to move cost recovery to local authorities as well, rather than relying on PPAs. PPAs, certainly in my experience, very difficult to put in place, and they don't always guarantee results anyway. Again, an issue of resourcing within councils, where even when you would like to give them some money, it can be very difficult to do so. So that may be a positive way of resolving that situation if authorities have got certainty that they can get resources in place to support the assessment of major projects. So that's again, we shall see. Colin mentioned the PINS service tiers. Again, in the current reform, there's quite a lot of text in there about the fact that applicants are not taking up the enhanced tier, and a suggestion that they may instead let PINS or the government make the decision over which service tier is appropriate. I would say if the service tier looks like the right level of support for the right price, then people are much more likely to choose it. If they're not choosing it, it's not looking like good value. When this is paid support to applicants with a finite project budget, you have the choice of whether you spend your budget with PINS getting advice, or whether that's with your planning consenting EIA team, with your legal support, or getting a KC opinion on various matters. So the PINS advice is essentially at the moment in a competitive environment with other providers of advice in that process. And so it has to look like good value for people to want to take it on. I think making that a government decision does it creates a risk of putting a load of additional burden on cost on applicants for what may not seem like good value, which is not achieving the objective of making the process go faster and reduce costs. Because all of these things together around cost recovery, they probably help, but they do mean a significant escalation in project costs. And again, that is counter to the intention here. We want to be able to get these projects through the system quicker and cheaper, but with effective quality development at the end of it. The next thing I wanted to touch on was the sort of range of current reform that we have at the moment, and what that means. I mean, we have this current consultation on NSIP reform, looking at things like consultation, acceptance tests, and so on. How we engage with regulators and the public all the way through. We are awaiting further detail of biodiversity net gain and how that will be implemented for NSIPs. And we were also expecting a roadmap for environmental outcome reports as well. So there's a huge, there's almost no area of NSIP planning which is not subject to change at the moment, and that's a huge amount of uncertainty for project applicants going into the system. It creates a lot of risk. Are you doing the right thing? Are you collecting the right evidence for the test that you will face at the end of it? And are you putting in place the right strategies, to achieve what the end goals will be around something like biodiversity net gain? There are some really key questions that are still unanswered following the last consultation on that. And to deliver quality BNG, you want to look at it at the start of the project, not at the very end, and try and stick it on as a last minute grab for some land where you can stick something which isn't of great biodiversity value. It'd be great to be able to do that properly. So just finally, thoughts on other things that do need reforming. Having said that, maybe a bit less reform might be helpful, and that is just on flexibility in the type of project. There is some flexibility around that, around associated development and Section 35, but those are still restricted either in Planning Act or in guidance, which is 12 years old for associated development. I think that really does need looking at. The Planning Act was conceived 20 years ago, and the sort of infrastructure that we need is evolving rapidly, and I think the system needs more flexibility on what can be in and out of that system to meet the needs of future infrastructure in this country. So that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. I think that's highly useful actually to get a promoter's perspective of what these reforms and the day-to-day working on a complex nationally significant infrastructure project means. And what you touched on in relation to certainty seems to be one of the key themes that maybe we'll touch on when we come to Q&A later as well. Just before we get to that, if I just introduce our final speaker, who is Alex Mahinick from Burgess Salmon. Alex is a partner in the planning and compulsory purchase team, and he's a specialist infrastructure planning lawyer with particular expertise in complex infrastructure projects across the energy, power and utility sector. He deals with CPO and developments relating to mines and minerals. He's a regular promoter of NSIPs, including the project that won the NIPA Project of the Year in 2023. So welcome, Alex. It'll be interesting to hear your thoughts on these reforms as well.
Thank you, Sarah, and good morning. Hello, everyone. Thank you also to Chris and Colin for their comments. Really interesting to get their insights. And I think, talking of that NIPA award, Chris very modestly didn't mention that the HyNet project won that award in 2024. So that's actually the latest recipient of that award for the work that he and team did there. So yes, the main thing that I'm intending to talk about in my slot is the current consultation that is out there that emerged recently. But just before we get onto that, I think it's just worth well, the question I was asking myself in preparing this talk is what progress have we made? What has worked? And the one thing that really strikes me at the moment, I think, is the policy base now. NSIPs, major infrastructure projects, are very reliant on the usually national level government policy base to bring them forward to deal with things like project need, and also to give guidance to applicants and those involved in the process as to how they should go about working their projects through the system. And I think it's important, and I think we should acknowledge that there has been some good progress in that regard. Now, if we just look at the national policy statements, the NPSs, for a moment, and I won't run through all of them, but we had a new suite of energy NPSs, which were designated at the beginning of last year in January 2024. We have, in fact, on those documents, had a further consultation on further proposed changes back in April of this year. We've also seen, and I acknowledge that it was a very long time in coming, but the Water Resources NPS was published in the summer of this year. And what else have we seen? We've had a consultation on a draft Energy NPS number 7, which would be dealing with policy for new nuclear power stations being deployed after 2025. That consultation was earlier this year. We've also seen a consultation on siting criteria for fusion nuclear projects, which came and the consultation on that happened in the summer of last year, 2024. So just pausing there, I suppose, and looking at that's principally in the energy and water fields. I think my point is that this suite of policy can take a long time to come into place, but it is, broadly speaking, there, and I think it does, broadly speaking, work, and it gives examining authorities, when they're looking at these applications, and the Secretary of State when they're deciding these applications, a solid and a sound basis on which to take those decisions. And I suppose just pulling out one of those examples, the energy NPSs, there's lots of projects coming through the system at the moment which are based on the energy NPSs. And whilst they were designated in 2024, the latest suite, it's actually only now in the second and third quarters of 2025 that we're starting to see that series of decisions which have been made under those documents. And one of the key factors which is woven into that new suite of energy NPSs is the critical national priority infrastructure policy, which is actually something that the Secretary of State hasn't needed to engage in detail on in respect of any of the projects that have come through yet, and therefore there is that policy piece in reserve should it need to come forward. But enough about the NPSs. We come on to reform. Lots of people are talking about reform at the moment, and the back to school, I suppose, consultation that landed on the first day of term, or possibly the day before the first day of term, depending on when terms start, is it's called the Consultation on Streamlining Infrastructure Planning, and it's a big consultation document. It's a broad-ranging consultation document. And it also sits within this existing landscape of reform that Colin and Chris have been talking about. So if we just remind ourselves of the 4 pillars of government reform in the NSIP process at the moment, on the first, in the first case, we've got further prompt updates of the national policy statements. The second area is greater flexibility around routes to consent, and that's principally talking about the introduction of directions to take projects out of today's DCO regime. The third pillar is then streamlining pre-application requirements, and that's what we're going to come on to talk about in a bit more detail. And then the fourth pillar is the output of the Lord Banner review into judicial review process, and seeking to make that process more proportionate. So concentrating then on that third pillar of those four that I just mentioned, streamlining the pre-application process, and that's a major focus of the current streamlining consultation that out. It's not the only focus, but it's the major one. And again, it's worth just reminding ourselves of the context for this current consultation, which is as part of the planning and infrastructure bill, which is still making its way through Parliament. Government has indicated that it intends to abolish the requirements for statutory consultation, which exist within the Planning Act, and replace those requirements with a guidance issuing duty on the Secretary of State. So the Secretary of State would issue guidance, which would help applicants in pre-application consultation with the parties they need to consult with, pre-application engagement, I should say, with the parties that they need to engage with at that pre-application stage. So local authorities, statutory bodies, landowners, and then local communities tend to be the key categories. What the current consultation does is it outlines a series of concerns, I suppose, with how the regime has evolved and how it's come to be practiced and how it operates today. It then suggests, I think, an overall shape of what the guidance that would be issued by the Secretary of State under this duty when it comes into force would be. And it then also raises a series of leading questions about what that guidance should contain. But what I suppose the government isn't doing is it hasn't said, here's a piece of draft guidance, what do you think? It's seeking to explore the issues that are in there. And I don't have time or scope to run through all of them, but I think the really important ones that jumped out at me were an indication that the detailed and technical documents which are produced by applicants as part of the existing statutory consultation process tend to pick up some negative press in this consultation document. The intimation is that the use of draft environmental statements, for example, is promoting consultation for fatigue and is disproportionate. Consultation also stresses the importance of continued pre-application engagement with local authorities and statutory bodies in particular to inform the likely impacts of a project and or an understanding of the likely impacts of a project, and help inform effective mitigation to address those issues and those impacts. But the stress in the consultation document is on proportionate levels of information and engagement with those bodies, rather than the existing practice that we have of the publication of draft environmental statements. The consultation acknowledges that it may be helpful to provide an indication and guidance to local authorities that engagement with promoters of projects on technical matters at an early stage would not later prejudice any views the authority may want to express about the project, for example, at the examination stage. And then another strand that jumped out at me is the indication that the best available practice for engaging with local communities, in particular, is often through events and forums rather than lengthy, detailed draft technical documents. I think it's worth pausing for a moment on the documents that are being considered at the pre-application stage. And what the consultation does is it acknowledges that consultation reports, the formal consultation hefty documents that we tend to submit with, well, don't tend to, that are submitted with DCO applications at the moment, they wouldn't be required, but the indication is that a voluntary engagement summary report would take their place. So that's one key point about what documents might be needed in the new shape of the regime. There's also a strong indication that government is thinking about the use of the evidence plan process, which at the moment tends to be used particularly for offshore schemes where there are habitat regulation assessments being carried out, but the indication is they could serve a useful purpose as part of the existing regime. Colin has already touched briefly on changes to the acceptance stage, and I think the key point to stress on acceptance is that what government is proposing is that we move from the standard of acceptance at the moment being a satisfactory standard to one that is classed as being suitable to proceed to examination. And the consultation, it really reiterates that that doesn't mean that all issues in the exam with the application have been resolved, but it have those issues been captured? Are they capable of examination? And the consultation also touches on detail about corrective actions, which is one of the other pieces of the amendments to the acceptance stage, whereby PINs would be able to direct applicants to address any deficiencies in the applications at the acceptance stage. Now, there is lots more in the consultation. It also looks at changes in the pre-examination and examination practice. But I wanted to pause for a moment at this stage on pre-app and acceptance, which I think show the greatest extent of change. And the question is obviously, what will those changes mean for applicants and projects, and will they in fact speed up the process? And this is something that we're helping a series of clients with on different projects at the moment. And whilst the default approach for projects remains of bringing forward your project in compliance with the existing regime, which has to be right, because until any legislative change happens, that continues to be the regime. Many of those projects, many of our clients are grappling with the question of what opportunities the new regime will allow. And the primary hope, of course, is that less extended formal requirements will speed up the process. And I think that must be right in principle, but one of the key challenges will be how input from these stakeholder bodies is obtained in the absence of the set piece consultation processes that we have at the moment, where information is typically passed and responses are requested. And the obvious example that jumps out will be engagement on things like baseline environmental surveys, which are then used to inform the design and the extent of mitigation which is required for any given project. Now, the consultation is saying that sort of engagement should continue, but it should be outside of the existing strictures of the statutory consultation process, which should allow applicants to be more nimble and proportionate in how they address those conversations. And I think Chris has accurately summed up some of the challenges in engaging with those bodies and the challenges that those statutory bodies themselves have in engaging in the process. So to wrap up, so that we can come on to some of the questions that have been asked, I think what all of this gets us to is I think there's a lot of positive indicators in the consultation that government is really focused on trying to streamline and speed up the NSIP process, and it's really focusing at the pre-application stage to try and get more projects into the process at a faster rate. And personally, while I think we need to see the proposed guidance itself, which will obviously shape that pre-application stage, my take is that all of this is pointing in the right direction, and I think government is thinking about sensible things. I think the current concern, I suppose, that I have, and I think that's shared with others in the industry, is whether the consultee bodies will be able to engage with the projects on the accelerated basis that it's hoped they can, to try and bring more and more of these projects into the regime.
Thank you, Alex. Excellent. So if I could just bring the sort of panel speakers back together again, then we've got a few questions coming through. So the first one, which is from Thomas O'Connor, who's addressing or asking a question around the point I think that Chris raised initially on costs for NSIPs, and making the point that many developers might be willing to pay for services, for instance, the enhanced PIN service, if it provides guarantees of a smoother and streamlined pathway to consent. And interested in the panel's views on the reasons why applicants might be reluctant to opt for this, and what might be helpful in terms of providing some sort of guarantees to give developers confidence in what they're actually getting out of the service. So Chris, did you want to provide just some further insights into that first?
Yeah, happy to. So it is a tricky one. I think, looking at that uptake, particularly of that enhanced tier, of whether that provides that streamlining and more efficient progress through the planning system. I think one of the issues for me is that enhanced tier, it seemed to me perhaps a bit of a muddle in terms of what it was intended to achieve. It was set out in that there were clear directions that if you wanted to go for a faster examination, then the enhanced tier would be appropriate. On the flip side, if you've got a very complex project, I wouldn't want to take Peak Cluster through an examination that was any quicker than 6 months. We will need 6 months. It's a complex thing. There's a lot to get through. I'm pretty happy with 6 months as a time for examination. There aren't many projects that really, I think, could be effectively dealt with much quicker than that, unless you were to force people to the table a little bit sooner to resolve things with third parties. But I guess that's really a separate issue. And I think the risk for me for that enhanced process is that it creates a lot of extra sort of bureaucratic burden, which might end up extending your pre-application period by several months in the hope of gaining several weeks at the back end. And for me, where you've got a significant additional cost for that service, that might be money that I would instead choose to spend on surveys or better consultation with communities or better engineering design or ground investigation. There's a whole host of competing priorities. So to voluntarily go for something which is more expensive has really got to show good value.
Thank you, Chris. I agree with you, and I think that it's ensuring that you're spending your money wisely, isn't it, given the importance of delivering these projects. And as you said, maybe it's not always about a faster examination, and sometimes it might be about having a more focused examination as well, concentrating on the right issues. Alex, did you want to come in on some of your observations about fast tracking of the process?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. The fast track is something that's covered off in the current streamlining consultation, and I suppose what government is saying there is people haven't taken us up on the offer. There's no projects that have applied to be fast tracked as yet, and I think Chris has probably just fairly summarised thematically perhaps why developers may not be pushing for that process. And it's quite, I mean, I think it's quite refreshing to see the consultation acknowledging that and saying, let's look at it, let's see what we can do to make that process more attractive to applicants in particular. And the key thing that I think or the key thing that jumps out to me and what they're saying, and the thing that I think they're settling on, is their intention. It's said it will be to focus on better coordinating the expert input and services from relevant statutory bodies. So PINs effectively facilitating input from other statutory bodies, together with the applicant obviously being in the room. And my take is that that's a very sensible thing to focus on. I think that will really help the likes of Chris bringing forward projects. If there is a if there is a mechanism there as part of the fast track whereby you can get, I suppose, priority access or priority engagement with these statutory bodies.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, that seems a very good point. And actually, I wonder if part of it as well is some uncertainty about knowing whether that engagement will then actually happen. And I think it's certainly some of the challenges that maybe applicants looking at the enhanced service have had so far as to whether that is able to happen in practice in the way that statutory bodies are currently resourced as well, and perhaps there might be some continued reluctance around that as well. We've got some more questions coming in, and if I could encourage any other questions that people want to raise, we've got about 10 minutes to go. So if I just move to the next question, which is from Stephen Walls at EDF, who's saying, I really wonder in practice whether all this will make a real difference on the timeline, the overall timeline of projects from origination to consent. Can see it around the edges, but it seems that there's a risk that bodies become less responsive. Colin, did you want to raise some of your views on that from your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Stephen. I mean, I've looked at this sort of overall timeline with a couple of developer clients, and we did, I suppose, reluctantly in one case, come to the conclusion that the enhanced service didn't seem to offer an overall benefit to their timeline from, as you say, origination or prior to inception stage to obtaining a robust and useful DCO consent. So I do have a little bit of insight there that there's an agreement with that. Like Alex has been saying, I mean, one of the focuses of the consultation seems to be about conducting or coordinating these statutory bodies, which have only just recently started this cost recovery. Now that they're sort of, if you like, running on all cylinders, it does make sense to me that there will be more coordination of them, because I think that's an area where the value is currently difficult to see for developers. It's all very well paying for all this advice from all these different bodies, but if it's not proportionate, if it's not coordinated, if it's not at the right times, actually it could create problems for you. It could create new new levels of information that may not be proportionate, may not and may even cut across one another. So I mean, you make the point about bodies becoming less responsive. I think that is sort of part of that point around how we coordinate, more sort of proportionate, more useful advice from these bodies. But I would say as well, there is a bit of a softening, I think, from the inspectorate around maybe some of the lines between some of these service tiers. So what I would say is, for example, the numbers that I quoted earlier, 4 out of 15 of the most recent DCOs to go through examination or recommendation or decision, they have had or are forecasted to have between 4 and 5.5 month examinations. Now that's a good number. I see that as a direction of travel. I don't think any of those are enhanced service, so they've achieved shorter examinations without going through enhanced. So I think you've got to keep trying to work within, I would say, the standard service or even the basic service. It's still possible to try for shorter examinations through those services. Thank
you, Colin. And we've got another question coming in, which is related to a similar theme, this point of balancing speed with quality, perhaps. So from Kirsty Lodge saying that the changes are welcomed. However, when looking into the amendments, do the panel feel that although the statutory processes are looking to be streamlined, this will just fundamentally add time onto the applicant at the front end, thereby potentially taking more time from concept stage to submission? And I think sort of a related point around that, do the panel feel that there are going to be challenges between sort of effectively nobody wanting to be the first one to test this. The process that we've got at the moment, peers have reached a particular stage, not necessarily with guidance that's required consultation and the associated environmental information to be as detailed and long as it is. Effectively that's happened over time. So does the panel really think that someone's going to want to go first doing a really streamlined approach? Chris, if I come to you first on that.
Yeah, I think this is a really good point, and one that has got to be borne in mind for any reform like this. And I'd say actually, in terms of the overall timeline that I'm interested in, it's from concept through to building it, and certainly from a concept through to a final investment decision. Yeah, and that means we must have not just got through examination, but got a decision and got through any sort of judicial review process. And so equally, there's a huge scope there to improve things at the back end. One of my fears, I guess, with shorter examinations and don't get me wrong, I would certainly, I'd welcome knocking a month off of examination. But what we've seen in recent years is and I should say, potentially situation improving slightly now, but secretaries of state more than happy to delay decision making over matters perhaps that haven't been fully resolved during examination. And a shorter examination just risks it risks pushing those further closing out of issues to what is in effect a second examination by correspondence with Secretary of State. So I want to see a system which resolves matters during the pre-application phase through really effective engagement with those statutory bodies and communities, a really effective examination that closes out those issues. And I want to see a Secretary of State empowered to take a decision on the evidence before them at the close of examination. And not just say, well, some things weren't quite done, let's do it all again, and effectively increase that period with an unknown extension to a decision being taken. So it has to be that focus on the end-to-end program. Absolutely right. And something which makes an improvement somewhere but just shifts the burden somewhere else is not helpful at all.
Thank you, Chris. Very valuable insights from a promoter on that as well. We've got 4 minutes left and the webinar will then just come to an end. So if I briefly just seek Alex's views on that same point, if there's anything you want to add, and then perhaps finish off with Colin. And I'd say that if we do just cut off, thank you very much for everyone for joining us today. But I'll bring the webinar to a close, hopefully in just a couple of minutes. Alex.
Thank you, Sarah. I'll be very brief. I think I agree with lots of what Chris has just said. I think it's a very good summary. I think for me, and coming back to Kirsty's question, the challenge is making sure there is an effective process of engagement with your key stakeholders, whoever they are, statutory bodies, local communities, landowners, local authorities, at that pre-application stage to try and flush out these issues that Chris has been talking about, to try and make sure that you either resolve them or you at least know what they are before you get into the examination. And I think in theory, changing the process can mean that can be done faster. I think the challenge will be practically achieving that and trying to make sure that all of the inputs are obtained.
Thank you, Alex. Absolutely, I completely agree with that. And Colin, did you have any final comments just before we draw things to a close?
Not a great deal to add, really. As Alex says, got to really use that pre-application stage to get those statutory body agreements and maximise agreements, and that is still the main, I would say, predictor of how your examination will fare. The basic or standard or enhanced service are sort of less of a factor, I would say, in how long your overall process takes.
Thank you, Colin. Well, thank you very much to all of our panelists today, some very useful insights at what I think is a really important critical time in infrastructure planning. And thank you very much as well to everybody who joined us today. We've had some really good interaction. Yeah, thank you everyone, and have a good day.